Good morning. Good morning. We meet at a pivotal moment of U.S. economic history and, quite frankly, my personal history. For over a quarter of a century, I've been railing relentlessly and boring others, and sometimes even myself, over our long-term unsustainable debts. Today, as a matter of fact, I didn't realize how boring I'd become until Ted Sorensen introduced me one day in the following way. He said, Peterson and I were on the trip to the Mideast when two terrorists stood up in the plane and said, we're going to assassinate these two former public officials on a nonpartisan basis, but we're going to give them their last wish. So they say, all right, Peterson, what's your last wish? Peterson says, I have one last speech I want to give to those on the plane about the relationship between the long-term debt and the American dream. Say, all right, Sorensen, you've heard Peterson, what's your last wish? And Sorensen said, I've heard Peterson make that speech, and my last wish is to be shot first. Today, many are raising their voices, calling for a solution to our challenges, fiscal challenges, beginning with fiscal cliff, which is hard to believe, but it's only 45 days away. We confront at least three critical challenges. First, there's the tension between short-term economic growth and long-term fiscal sustainability. We must somehow accelerate a slow recovery and create more jobs. But we also must acknowledge the realities of our unsustainable long-term fiscal conditions. I think it was Herb Stein who first reminded us, speaking of unsustainable, that if something's unsustainable, it tends to stop. And he said to me one day, if you don't like that one, Pete, I suggest the following. If your horse is dying, I suggest you dismount. So the decision before us is whether we plan our dismount or the horse does it for us. How do we address our long-term challenges without hurting our short-term economic growth? Or can we both address our long-term challenges and at the same time stimulate the short-term economy? The second of three challenges, the fiscal cliff, is a major test of our political system. It's clear that any long-term plan will need support from both parties, and most particularly the president, to become law. So how will we build the political will for bipartisanship now where none has existed before? Any solution is going to require compromise and sacrifice, and those have become two of the dirty words in the Washington political language. But they are both essential in any solution. Now, in recent days, we've heard some encouraging words from both sides. What do we do to lubricate this indispensable political process? Third, the cliff is a test of market confidence. Going over the cliff could lead to market fears and economic contraction. However, even just another disappointing kicking of the can could drive a major negative reaction in the market and therefore our economy, fueled by seeds of doubt about America's fiscal stability and our political resolve. Today, our leaders in Washington are faced with both a political imperative and an economic imperative to act. As economic, fiscal, market, and political pressures all mount, we'll have to answer a critical question. Are we going to shape these forces, or are they going to shape us? Last week, the voters delivered a mandate, not a mandate for one party or another, but a mandate to finally get together and get something done. I believe the sobering fiscal and economic realities, combined with the mandate of the voters, can produce some forward momentum, and I hope these discussions today can lead us in that direction. I cannot imagine two better speakers to help us begin to sort through these issues. They need no introduction. and therefore I'm not going to give them one. I just hope, gentlemen, that our friendship is not impaired by my not introducing you. I'm referring, of course, to two former chairmen of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and I give you two very distinguished economists, statesmen, and friends, Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker. Gentlemen. Excuse me.
You're in the middle of it, John. Okay. I'm on the right one. That's the right
You two gentlemen have witnessed some major economic events in your long careers. What would you think be the impact on the economy if we go over the cliff? What if policymakers, on the other hand, kicked the can down the road for several months but failed to address the current gap between revenues and spending policies and failed to stabilize long-term debt? Paul, how would you answer that?
Well, I think maybe a little too much has made this over-the-cliff business. We're not going to solve this long-range problem, in my view, in the next 7 weeks, 9 weeks, whatever we have. It's going to take some time. We have to deal with the short-run problem. We have this thing that's sitting here with a big sequester and a big tax increase, so that has to be dealt with in terms of the immediate economy. And I think that can be done. But that will take some action on taxes and on spending, but it won't be the action that cures the longer-term problem. That's going to take some time, and I wouldn't call that kicking down the road. It's going to take some time to redesign the tax system, which needs a redesign, and to, in a convincing way, put restraints on spending that's going to deal with that yawning deficit over years ahead.
And you, Dr. Greenspan?
Well, I agree with Paul. I think that there are really two separate issues here, but we have to recognize that how we solve the short-term issue is going to affect how we address the longer term. And my main concern is that we don't recognize how difficult a problem this is going to be. We have essentially picked all of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, of the fiscal system. We have stretched ourselves beyond comprehension, and the basic problem, as we'll get into a little later, is fundamentally the issue of spending. We have had a significant rise in so-called government social benefits for persons, as the Bureau of Economic Analysis likes to call it. It's going up at a tremendous rate, and the great irony of this is that it's went up even faster during the prudent years of Republican administrations, more so than the spendthrift Democrats. This is a bipartisan problem. And I think that we've got to really stop it, and we have to stop it clearly, because I think the real difficulty here is it is, for reasons I can get to a little later, dollar for dollar eroding the savings of a society, and savings is the fundamental input for capital investment, and capital investment is the primary ingredient for productivity. Our growth in productivity has slowed down. Our growth rate has slowed down. And what we are looking at is, unless and until we solve this particular short-term problem, to get on to the longer-term problem, we're going to find the markets are going to respond very negatively. And my fundamental concern is we have to realize where we're going cannot continue indefinitely, because it's eating into the productivity and the growth rate of the economy. And if we don't have that, how do we finance are benefit programs. You can write entitlements as long as you want in the Congress, but where are the physical resources going to come from to meet them? So I think that there's a very critical issue here with kicking it down the road is not going to help, because I will tell you one thing we don't look at is the markets may respond negatively before we even notice it, and that's going to cause a huge problem.
Well, tell me, I think in the case of Europe, you can take any of the countries you wish. The action taken happened very suddenly, it seemed to me, and quite surprisingly. Do you have any sense of how much time do you think the market's going to give us before they react in a strong way?
The one thing about markets is they don't give you any advance notice. If, in fact, they could give you advance notice, the problems would be arbitraged away. So by definition, a crisis coming from markets doesn't give you advance notice. And we've got to recognize that fact and not catch ourselves and say, well, we're going to deal with this thing when the crisis arises. That's a little late in the game.
Paul, what do you say about that?
Well, I agree. You're not going to know when this happens. It's impossible to forecast just when it is. It depends upon too many different things. But if we go along forever, it isn't going to go along forever, and you're going to have a crisis at some point. Now, how do you deal with that? You can't cure it overnight, that's for sure. Spending is a crux of the problem. You got a lot of that built in. It's going to take years to get back relation to GDP, or however you want to measure it, to something that's sustainable. How do you create the program now that's convincing that, in fact, you're talking about 2013 or 2014, that you've got a convincing program that's going to get you to the right place in 2020? And it's going to take that long to get back to a balanced budget, if you want to talk about actual balanced budgets. And how do you, we won't have the crisis, or we minimize the chance of a crisis, if people are convinced you're on the path. Now, how do you get people convinced that you're on the path to deal with it over a period of years? I think that's the political problem that exists at the moment. Assuming you can get some consensus, how do you convince the American public, or not just the American public, but the world, that the United States is on a sustainable path?
I think that one of the questions I get asked more often when I express the concerns you two gentlemen are expressing is, where else are they going to put their money?
Pardon me?
No, the question I get asked by people often when I express these concerns is, where else are the lenders going to put the money but the United States?
Versus
yeah, the United States versus other countries. There are no other countries people are going to put a lot of money in.
Yeah.
So what are you worried about?
Look, I think that's to some extent been true currently, but we can't count on that being the case forever. We've got big people looming up. China's going to be different in a few years. Japan may have some recovery. Europe, we hope, gets out of its problems. We can't sit here and say we're going to deal with this problem because everybody else is worse off than we are. I mean, that's a kind of crazy approach, and it's not consistent with the kind of leadership the United States needs, not just in economic affairs, but in political affairs. We can't simply accept that argument that other people are worse off than we are.
Well, we've had the great blessing of a reserve currency, haven't we?
Well, the great blessing, you say.
Let's talk about how permanent that arrangement is.
Well, yeah, it's a two-edged sword. It's very convenient. It's enabled us to finance deficits very easily at low interest rates, so the foreigners own half the debt, and we've got to finance the balance of payments. I was struck the other day, Karl Marx is not a very popular figure anymore, but once in a while he said things that were sensible. He says, give bankers enough rope, they'll hang themselves. You give countries enough rope, they hang themselves too. Let's look at the southern tier of Europe. They could borrow and borrow very easily. until it stopped. And borrowing indefinitely very easily is a good recipe for a first-class crisis.
Yeah, you know, I think you got to, this issue of where they're going to put their money, there are two fundamental problems. One is that the assets can just evaporate. In short, wealth is essentially two factors. It's income, but more importantly, it's the forward rate of discount to those future expected incomes, which gives you the value of how many assets you really have to invest. And there's a very simple solution. If you're running into problems, what will happen is that the discount factors will rise, indeed as they are, and values collapse. But even having said that, there's a whole structure of other things people can do. And they can take their money and put it in goods. Or, as a currency, there is gold. And so that this notion that they can't put it anyplace, I think is just nonsense. Investors can, and they will do it in the wrong places for the wrong reasons, but whatever they may do, it's not good.
Mm-hmm. Paul, do you want to add anything to that? Or is it? Okay. You raised to me an interesting, pressing question, Paul, which is how do we give credibility that we're actually this time going to do something when the problems that we're describing are very complex, whether it's reforming the tax system or reforming entitlements or whatever. Do you have any ideas on what kind of...
Well, a good answer to that, I would tell you, because I wouldn't keep it a big secret. But inherently, it's a difficult problem when you're talking about something that has to take place over a series of years. But you do one or two things, at least. You say you have a target which is accepted on generally by the President, by the Congress. And one way of expressing it, I guess the way Simpson-Bowles did, was what percent of the GDP will you aim at for expenditures and use as a target for your spending programs, whatever the spending programs are, the entitlements, defense, civilian, and keep that sense of commitment as best you can. But it's still just it's hard to put it in law. You can put it in law, but what's the law mean? You can't predict what's happened several years down the road. But do we have a consensus that we want to get spending, which I guess has been got as high as 25% of the GDP, 24 or close to it now. Historically, it was 20. Can we get it back to 20? Very tough. But is 21% a reasonable goal? 22% a reasonable goal? That's one way of going about it. Another way of just setting a numerical target for spending and taxation. But in either case, how do you... On the tax side, in a way, it's easier because you can change the tax law, and that's in place. You can't change... I don't think you can have a law that controls spending for 10 years.
Yeah, you know, I think there's a very interesting issue on policy basis. It is extremely difficult to rescind entitlements to which people think they are legally entitled, and that if you're doing that, you're abrogating contracts of some form. And then, of course, there are all sorts of constituencies under every entitlement program which support it. The issue, however, is taxes can always go up and down. There isn't the same political pressures there. As far as I'm concerned, I think the issue here is fundamentally spending. If we have to pay a high price in raising taxes temporarily in order to get spending down, I think that's a good deal. I mean, I don't think that you can continuously keep this deficit open. And I grant you, if you raise taxes, we're going to turn the economy down. But if the cost of getting out from under this problem is a moderate recession, I would say it is cheap price, very low price. I think with somehow thinking we're going to get through this thing without pain, that's utter nonsense. This is a very dangerous situation. And it's not a question of whether we pay a large painful price or a small painful price. The question is, which is the least worst of our alternatives? And as far as I'm concerned, if we have to pay a large price in increasing taxes in order to get this extraordinary, unstoppable rise in spending, if we need to do that, I think we have to do that, and then recognize that it's politically far easier to lower taxes than it is to lower spending.
Paul?
Let me take back a little bit what I said before. There are some areas that you can work on in spending kind of immediately that are built in. We can do something about Social Security. Social Security, I think, is a lesser part of the entitlement problem, but it's a problem. And I think it is a soluble problem by means that have been much discussed. And once you put that in place, as Alan Greenspan did 20 years ago, whenever it was, you've got something that's going to last for years. And theoretically, you could do something about Medicare, too. I don't understand enough about Medicare to give particular suggestions, but the entitlement programs you can redesign. You can't do it in 6 months, but you can do it. But defense spending, civilian spending, dependent upon year-by-year appropriations, a little more difficult to put it in place and say, there it is for 10 years.
You know, as I've listened to various schools of thought, it seems to me there are at least three. One is our short-term problem is so primary that we have to get around to stimulating the economy short-term and let the long-term take care of itself later. There are those who I think, Alan, are what I heard you say, that getting the long-term situation under control is so central that you're willing to take steps that may actually retard the economy short-term. Then there's another school of thought that says you can do both in the following way. You can lay out a plan for the long term that will create confidence that you're going to do something, but it doesn't get put into effect until the economy has recovered. What school of thought do each of you fall here? Or maybe there's a fourth.
Well, first of all, I don't think the markets would find the issue of we'll solve the long-term problem. We promised to do that. We'll pass legislation and let us now do the short term. The markets are going to start to laugh at some point. And the form of the laughter is markets run into real serious problems. You know, I think that we've got to stop the recognition of I mean, this is a problem. We're in a democratic society. In a democratic society, we all, especially one based on individualism, we all have our own ideas. But compromise is not an abrogation of principle. It is basically a recognition that we choose, in order to maintain the fundamental structure of our society, to compromise. And we used to do that all the time. The stress between the various parties is actually no greater now than it's ever been. You go back and you look at the distribution of the caucuses within the House and the Senate, they all look precisely like they did with the Waits and the conservatives and then the liberals 100 years ago. The problem is, unlike what we used to do 20 years ago, and Paul would remember this far better than I, people used to speak to each other across the aisle and talk to each other and come to an agreement, and it was never really a big, difficult problem. Now, I don't think they do. And unless and until that starts, until there's a comedy at a level which gives us majority votes, I think this is going to be very tough.
Well, I take it there are people who say, Alan, that it's so difficult to get people to talk to one another that you have to create a crisis, which is the only thing that will get them talking to each other. Now, you know, in medicine there's this phrase, iatrogenic, diseases caused by the doctor, you know. I don't know what that strategy leads to, but what do you think of that point of view?
For me?
Yeah, either one of you.
I don't disagree with it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
And you, Paul? You
Well, we don't
has the dialogue reached such a de minimis stage?
We make artificial crises for ourselves, like this current business of over the cliff. I mean, that's a political crisis, not an economic crisis.
You know, Paul, I think the real interesting issue is, why do we have a debt ceiling? I mean, basically, we have an appropriations process which creates the spending level. We have a tax code. And if you're even remotely adroit in arithmetic, you could figure out what the President and the Congress has already passed for where the deficit and the debt ceiling, the debt ought to be. Now you come in with a new, it's like suspenders in a belt.
Congress likes the debt ceiling.
Well, you know, it goes back to the Liberty Funding Act, you know, World War I.
World War I, that's correct.
And it was, you know, originally the Congress had to pass legislation for every issuance of debt, and so they speeded up the process by putting in a debt ceiling and substituting it. And we still got it, and I just don't get it, frankly.
Well, if you were a congressman, you like to complain about government spending, you like to have that little trigger so you can talk about it every once in a while.
That's the trouble.
It's not a very good idea.
Better they spend their time doing something.
But look, go back to Pete's earlier question. I'm in your third group. We don't have to tighten right at the moment, given the state of the economy. It's going to take some time to get this consensus that we all want on the spending and on the taxes. But it's not going to be January 2013. It's going to be 2014, 2015 before that gets put in place. And it should. It's not easy to change this tax thing where you say, let's get rid of some deductions and loopholes and so forth. All those loopholes and deductions are there because people want them. And we ought to get rid of a lot of them, but that's a big debate as to which ones you get rid of and how you get rid of it. And thinking you're going to resolve that in 2 weeks or 6 weeks or 9 weeks is foolish.
Well, you mentioned taxes, and one of the biggest debates obviously going on is what you do about taxes on those above $250,000. If one of my roles is to try to present kind of various sides of the debate, there is a school of thought that it's the over $250,000 that are so-called job creators, and if you increase taxes on those above $250,000, you'll have a significant effect on the economy. This is part of a larger question of how serious is the effects on the economy by raising taxes. But let's start with a narrow question. Suppose that the taxes were increased for those above $250,000, but not the rest. What would you guess the effects would be of that?
0.
Well, that's a nice, clear number. Yeah.
Well, I don't quite agree with Paul on that, because there's, leaving aside the issue of the sort of political notions of who should get taxed and what, there's no question that the vast proportion of personal savings, which is the bigger part of gross domestic savings in the economy, are lodged in the upper income groups. To the extent that you increase taxes on them, you are essentially reducing savings. And the data are very clear on this. And savings are a necessary condition for capital investment and productivity growth, as I mentioned before. And so, leaving aside the argument, which I think is a debatable argument of to what extent the issue affects the economy directly through the so-called job creation, I don't look at it as job creation issue. I mean, That's sort of a secondary, tertiary effect. I look at it as on the problem that there's one remarkable stability in the economy in the last 30, 40 years, and that it is the sum of government social benefits to persons as one series, and the gross domestic savings of the economy on the other. If you add them together, they've ranged between, I think, 26 and 28% of the GDP going back into the mid-1960s. And what you see is almost dollar for dollar that as the increase in the benefits rises, savings goes down, and this fundamentally affects the long-term outlook. I think if you, for example, project the issue of savings continuing as a stable proportion of the GDP, which it had been from, say, 1983 back, and you look at the actual decline that's going on in savings, and you can attribute it directly to the spending rise. And I think that's the reason we've got to stop this extraordinary, uncontrollable rise in spending. It's affecting our long-term growth. And the irony is, without the long-term growth, as I said before, you don't have the resources to meet the benefits that are being created by the Congress, which are paper benefits. They don't create anything. They just give a right to who gets distributed what is produced. But if you're not producing it, what's the good?
Well, I take it, see if I understand your answers. Paul would say it has zero effect.
Let me,
and I'm sure you'll want to elaborate.
Let me elaborate.
I hear you, Alan, saying, well, you don't like it if it's part of a total package that gets at the spending problems. You think it's a price worth paying.
Are you talking about raising taxes?
Yes.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. And you, Paul, do you want to...
Well, I don't think changing that particular tax rate at this particular time is going to have a big effect on the economy. But overall, there's a good argument for keeping tax rates as low as possible and lower than that level that would result then. But that takes a lot of consideration of the total tax system and how you organize it and what taxes you want to rely upon. And you get into corporate taxes as well as personal taxes and what you want to do about deductions and all the rest. And I would aim ultimately for a balanced budget. And you want to aim for it at as low a level as spending as you can get by with. And I don't know exactly what that is, but it's a good deal lower in trend than we have now. And that is a fundamental problem. There's no question about it. And then we've got to devise a tax system that is going to produce whatever it takes, 20%, 21%, 22% of the GDP, and do that in the most efficient way we can. And I think the present tax system is pretty well broken. I'm not sure we can rely so much on the income taxes we have in the past. We ought to begin looking at more consumption-oriented taxes.
No, I agree with this. And in fact, I think it's a terribly important point. Because remember what taxation is for. It's to fund the spending which we appropriate. And spending comes first, and then you decide how much you need to raise in taxes. This notion that we can somehow manage the fact that taxes and spending don't go together has been a failure. We've tried it for years, and you've been arguing against the deficit. Well, the reason basically is, you may recall, the general ethos in the United States before, I would say, the 1970s maybe, or even a little earlier than that, was the fact that the federal budget ought to have taxes equal to spending. I remember President Eisenhower apologized to the American people for a very small deficit. We got very sophisticated with our macroeconometric models as to how you can manipulate the economy by moving fiscal policy. Well, there's a terrible bias in the way the system works, which has led us to this fiscal cliff, which would have occurred even without the debt ceiling. Because you've been railing about this, I regret to say, against no interest whatsoever, but we've come down to the point where our very sophisticated economic policies have led us to this part. And I think the way Paul put it, I say is exactly right. Namely, you decide what you need to do for spending, and then you raise whatever is required to fund that. And stop with this business of, well, we can do a 3% deficit because it doesn't change the level of debt to GDP. That is factually correct, but it is irrelevant because if you try to do that, you won't make that either. And that's what's happening.
Let me shift a little bit to Europe and try to help me understand this situation. First, what lessons does the European experience teach us? And second, there are a few indications that maybe Europe is coming up with some possible answers to their problems. What happens? A lot of the money has been flowing out of the euro, I think, because of deep concern about the European situation. But what are the chances that the Europeans might be getting their act together? And if they did, what effect would that have on us?
I don't think they are getting their act together. I mean, they're kicking the can down the road. What they're fundamentally doing is financing a very large part of the fiscal deficits of the 17 countries of the Eurozone with central bank money. You can look at the size of the European Central Bank balance sheet, and for example, in the last year it's gone up more than €1 trillion funding essentially the deficits of the individual countries by either lending directly or essentially buying the bonds of the particular countries. But there is no evidence that they're converging. That is, in the Greek situation is classic. I mean, I cannot imagine how the level of debt in Greece is ever going to be paid off. And the problem ultimately is that the guarantors in Northern Europe of the extraordinary behavior of some of the Southern Europeans is running into political problems in the North. And I just don't think this thing is coming together. And as I wrote in an article over a year ago, I think I did an article in the Financial Times, this is a cultural problem. And I think that the euro is going to have very great difficulty in holding together.
Paul, you want to add anything to this?
Well, on the euro, I hope it holds together, but it's a very difficult road to follow, as they are finding with the levels of unemployment they have in some of the southern European countries. But I think the big lesson here is, referred to earlier, you had a situation where there was virtually no restraint on Greece and Spain and Italy and borrowing money cheaply, partly because they were part of the Eurozone and that felt to provide the answers, and they could borrow at the same interest rates that you could borrow in Germany that was a strong country. And they borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, and they got in trouble. They're small countries. The United States is a very big country, but we have some of that symptom. And we don't want to have the breakdown that they had in Europe when they reached the limits that the markets would take on their borrowing. I think it's a real lesson for us here. It's a fundamental lesson.
All right, just to wrap this up a little bit, I want the two of you to play God for a moment. I think you're playing. Well, perhaps you are already in that state. We've outlined today some challenges, short-term, long-term, and so forth. If the president were to call you into the Oval Office and say, okay, all things considered, what should I do? what would you have him do?
I'd like Paul to handle that one first.
Look, obviously you got to make a deal in the short run as to what to do about this untenable situation of the big sequesters and the tax increases for everybody. So they got to work out a short-term deal then. Then I would get hard work and a pretty fundamental look at the tax system, and more or less at the same time you got to look at certainly Social Security, certainly got to look at Medicare, and what can you do that's convincing in terms of the other expenditures over a period of time. And I think that's a very tough thing, but is there a consensus on the broad level of spending that we're willing to pay for in taxes? And I'm afraid that that's more than 20%, which is what the historic relationship has been to GDP. But I don't know if it has to be much above that, but that's the question.
You, Alan?
Well, everyone is saying the right thing, so to speak. I mean, both the White House and the Congress, they've been saying the right thing for a long time, but nothing's happened. And so I basically say unless and until we literally decide that we're willing to forego some of our privileges on both sides of the aisle, we can talk all we're going to, we can posture as much as we'd like, but it's not going to make any difference. We've got to act.
Mm-hmm.
The markets are going to, let me say this, on September the 14th, on a program shortly after the Simpson Bowles was announced, I was asked on, I just barely had understood that it just had come out, whether Simpson Bowles would be usable by the Congress. And I said that Simpson Bowles is what will ultimately pass, and the only question is whether it is before or after a crisis. I still hold to that view.
Okay. I've raised a lot of questions. What should I have asked that I didn't?
You're always comprehensive, Mr. Chairman.
You want to have the Peterson plan? Is that what this conference is all about?
Well, I'd be thrilled if that were the case. All right. Please thank these two great, very well done.